Alright, before you decide this is just another prove them wrong story, let me ask you something. Have you ever had someone who was supposed to love you look you straight in the eye and tell you that you were nothing? Not a phase. Not a mistake. Nothing. Because that moment has a way of staying with you for decades. It sits in your chest, it echoes when the house is quiet, and it quietly shapes every decision you make after. And today, I'm telling you how a single sentence spoken to a 17-year-old girl lit a fire that built an empire so big, so undeniable, that the very person who said those words was left completely speechless. I still remember the sound of the kitchen clock that morning. Tick. 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 Old, loud, relentless. The kind of clock you notice only when everything else has gone silent. I was standing there with my backpack half-zipped, college pamphlets spread across the table like they were evidence in a trial. My hands were shaking, but my voice wasn't. I told her I wanted to apply out of state. I told her I had plans. Big plans. I told her I didn't want to end up stuck. She didn't yell. She didn't slam anything. She just laughed. A short laugh. Cold. Then she said it. You're useless. You always have been. You don't have what it takes. 17 years old. That's the age when you're still figuring out who you are, but old enough for words to cut deep and stay there. I felt my face burn. Not from anger. From humiliation. From realizing that the person who should have believed in me the most never had. My name is Kiley Morrison, and that sentence followed me for a very long time. We lived in a small town where everyone knew your last name before they knew your dreams. My mom worked hard, I'll give her that. She believed in survival, not ambition. In staying put. In knowing your place. And in her mind, my place was small. Quiet. Forgettable. She told neighbors I was lost. Told family members I was not very motivated. By the time I was in high school, I had started to believe her. Or at least, I was afraid she might be right. But here's the thing no one tells you when you're young. Being told you're useless doesn't always break you. Sometimes, it rewires you. That morning, after she said those words, I walked out without another sound. I didn't cry in front of her. I cried on the bus. Silent tears, staring out the window, watching the same streets I'd seen my whole life roll past. And somewhere between Main Street and the old gas station, something inside me hardened. Not in a bitter way. In a determined way. If I was useless, then I had nothing to lose. I worked every job I could get. Diner shifts where my feet ached so badly I soaked them in ice water at night. Babysitting. Cleaning offices after hours. I saved every dollar in a shoebox under my bed because I didn't trust banks yet, and honestly, I didn't trust anyone. When acceptance letters came, she barely looked at them. When I told her I'd gotten a small scholarship, she said, "Don't get your hopes up. Life has a way of humbling people like you. People like you." I left 2 weeks after graduation. No big goodbye. No hugs. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed, watching me load my one suitcase into a borrowed car. Right before I got in, she said, "Just don't come crawling back." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because part of me was terrified that I might. The first year away was brutal. For those of you listening who are past 60, you know this feeling well. That moment when pride keeps you going even when logic says you should quit. I lived in a cramped apartment with peeling paint and a radiator that hissed all night like it was angry at the world. I skipped meals. I lied when people asked how I was doing. I smiled through exhaustion because failure felt louder than hunger. Every time I wanted to give up, I heard her voice. Useless. And instead of letting it stop me, I used it like fuel. I studied harder than anyone else I knew. Not because I loved every subject, but because I refused to be average. I took notes obsessively. I asked questions even when my voice shook. Professors started to notice. One of them pulled me aside after class and said, "You're different. You don't just want to pass. You want to build something." No one had ever said that to me before. That sentence mattered more than he probably realized. After graduation, I didn't get some glamorous job. I got rejection emails. Dozens of them. I lived on cheap coffee and cheaper dreams. But one night, sitting on the floor of that same apartment, I had a realization that changed everything. I didn't need permission. I didn't need approval. And I definitely didn't need my mother's belief to succeed. I started small. So small most people would have laughed if they knew. I took a problem I understood deeply, something people my age were struggling with, and I tried to solve it better than anyone else. I failed. Then failed again. Then almost failed so badly I nearly lost everything. But each failure taught me something my mother never did. How to adapt. How to listen. How to lead. Years passed. Quietly. No headlines. No applause. Just work. Relentless, boring, exhausting work. And slowly, the thing I was building started to stand on its own. It grew legs. Then a backbone. Then a voice. By the time my phone started ringing with opportunities instead of rejection, I hadn't spoken to my mom in years. Not out of spite. Out of self-preservation. And then, one day, I got the call that would change everything. But that's where I'll stop for now. That call came on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of ordinary day where nothing feels like it's about to change. I almost didn't answer it. Unknown number. I was standing in line at a grocery store, counting items in my basket like I always did, still careful, still cautious, even though life had already started shifting in my favor. Something told me to pick up. Maybe instinct. Maybe fate. Maybe just curiosity. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, confident. They said my company's name out loud, and hearing it spoken by someone else felt surreal. They told me they'd been watching what I'd built. Not just the numbers, but the way I ran things. The culture. The growth. The consistency. Then they said the sentence that made my knees weak right there between the cereal aisle and the checkout counter. "We'd like to talk acquisition." I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. My mind went somewhere else entirely. It went back to that kitchen. To that clock. To that word. Useless. I finished paying, walked out to my car, sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, and finally said yes. That meeting changed everything. Not overnight, not magically, but undeniably. For the first time in my life, people didn't see me as potential or promise. They saw me as power. Negotiations followed. Lawyers. Long nights. Big decisions that carried real weight. The kind of weight that presses into your chest and reminds you that this isn't a game anymore. When the deal closed, I didn't celebrate right away. I drove home in silence. I sat on my couch and stared at the wall for a long time. And then I laughed. Not out of joy. Out of disbelief. I had done it. Not just survived. Built something real. Something no one could take away from me. That's when the thought of my mother crept back in. I hadn't planned to tell her. Honestly, part of me didn't care if she ever knew. But life has a strange way of reopening doors you thought were sealed shut. A cousin reached out first. Then an aunt. Then a family friend. News travels fast when success shows up uninvited. A few weeks later, my phone rang again. This time, I recognized the number. I almost didn't answer that one either. Her voice sounded older. Softer. Like time had taken its toll in ways it never touched me. She asked how I was. I said fine. She said she'd heard things. I said people talk. There was a pause. A long one. Then she asked if we could meet. I said yes, and surprised myself by meaning it. We met at a restaurant halfway between where she lived and where I worked. Neutral ground. Public. Safe. She arrived early. I could see her through the window, sitting stiffly, hands folded like she was waiting for a verdict. When I walked in, she stood up too fast and knocked her chair back. That moment told me everything. She was nervous. We sat down. Small talk followed. Weather. Traffic. The kind of empty words people use when they're afraid of the real ones. Finally, she looked at me and said, "I didn't realize. I didn't know you were doing so well." There it was. Not an apology. Not pride. Just surprise. I told her about the company. Not bragging. Just facts. Revenue. Employees. Expansion. The more I spoke, the quieter she became. Her eyes darted around the table like she was trying to ground herself. When I mentioned the acquisition, she actually stopped chewing. "You built all that?" she asked. I nodded. By the time the check came, she hadn't said much else. Outside the restaurant, she hugged me. It was awkward. Careful. Like she was hugging a stranger who might disappear if she squeezed too tight. As I drove away, I realized something important. That moment didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure trying to knock, but not quite getting in. Because success doesn't erase the past. It just puts it in context. Months went by. Invitations came. Speaking engagements. Panels. Features. People wanted to hear my story. And every time I told it, I felt a little lighter. Like I was reclaiming something that had been stolen early on. Then came the invitation that made everything circle back. A regional business summit reached out and asked me to give the keynote. Big venue. Full house. Press attending. They wanted me to talk about resilience. About building something from nothing. I almost said no. Public speaking still scared me. But then I thought about the girl on that bus, crying silently, believing she might be nothing. I said yes for her. The night of the event, the lights were bright, the room buzzing with conversation. I stood backstage, heart racing, palms sweating, reminding myself to breathe. That's when one of the organizers approached me and said, "Your mom's here, by the way." She seemed very proud. That word hit harder than I expected. I didn't look for her during my speech. I focused on the audience. On the message. On telling the truth without softening it. I talked about doubt. About being underestimated. About what happens when someone else's limitations are projected onto you. The room was silent when I finished. Then it erupted. Standing ovation. Backstage, she found me. Her eyes were wet. Her hands were shaking. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say 100 things, but only one came out. I was wrong. 3 words. That's all. In that moment, something inside me shifted. Not because she admitted it. But because I no longer needed her to. That's where part of this story pauses, not ends. Because what happened after that, the real test of everything I'd built. Inside and out, is something I haven't told many people. After that night, people assumed everything was healed. That's what audiences like to believe, especially those neat stories where one confession fixes years of damage. But real life doesn't work that way, and if you've lived long enough, you know that already. Words can open a door, but they don't magically rebuild what was never constructed in the first place. For a while, my mom tried. She called more often. Asked questions she'd never asked before. Wanted updates. Wanted to be included. And I let her, carefully, the way you let someone walk across a frozen lake one slow step at a time. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even resentful. I was just aware. Aware of what it cost me to get where I was, and how much of that journey I'd walked alone. Around that time, the empire people talk about now really began to take shape. The acquisition was just the beginning. I reinvested almost everything. New ventures. New risks. Bigger stakes. I hired people who reminded me of myself at 17. Smart. Quiet. Overlooked. I paid them fairly. I listened to them. I made it a point to never speak to anyone the way I had been spoken to. And that decision came back to me tenfold. The company grew fast, then faster. Offices in different states. Numbers that didn't feel real when I looked at them on spreadsheets. But here's something that might surprise you. The bigger it got, the quieter my inner world became. Success didn't make me loud. It made me still. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't running from anything. That's when the real test showed up. One evening, I got another call. This one wasn't about business. It was from a hospital near my hometown. My mom had collapsed at work. Heart issues. Complications. They asked if I was her next of kin. I remember sitting there with the phone in my hand, staring at the wall, feeling 17 and 30 at the same time. The past and present crashing into each other. For a moment, I thought about not going. About letting someone else handle it. About protecting the peace I had built so carefully. Then I remembered something important. Healing isn't about what the other person deserves. It's about who you choose to be. I went. She looked small in that hospital bed. Smaller than I remembered. The woman who once filled every room with certainty now looked fragile, unsure, almost afraid. When she saw me, she started crying immediately. Not dramatic tears. Quiet ones. The kind that come from deep places. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. I sat down beside her and took her hand. It felt strange. Familiar and foreign at the same time. She apologized then. Really apologized. Not vague. Not defensive. She named the things she'd done. The words she'd said. The ways she'd failed me. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her. I didn't rush her. When she finished, she looked at me like she was waiting for a sentence. A verdict. Something that would decide the rest of her life. I didn't give her one. I just said, "I'm here." That moment wasn't about forgiveness. It was about choice. I chose not to carry the weight anymore. Not because she asked, but because I was tired of holding it. After she recovered, things changed again. Not dramatically. Not perfectly. But honestly. She stopped trying to take credit for my success. Stopped telling people she'd always known. Instead, she listened. Sometimes awkwardly. Sometimes silently. But she listened. And I learned something important through that season. Revenge isn't loud. It doesn't need witnesses. The real kind is quiet. It's living well without needing to prove anything. But life wasn't done testing me yet. A few months later, during a routine review, my financial advisor brought something to my attention. A competitor had been quietly circling one of my earliest projects. The one I'd built from scratch. The one closest to my heart. They wanted to buy it. Not partner. Not collaborate. Buy. For a number that made the room go silent. This was the kind of offer people dream about. The kind that changes generations. And suddenly, I was faced with a decision that felt heavier than any deal before it. Because selling meant letting go of the very thing that had saved me when I was young. The thing that proved my mother wrong before she ever admitted it. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. I walked through my house in the dark, thinking about 17-year-old me. About how she would have answered without hesitation. Take the money. Win. Show them. But I wasn't her anymore. The next morning, I declined the offer. Instead, I expanded. Doubled down. took the long road. And that decision became the foundation for something even bigger. Something that would outlive trends, headlines, even me. That's when the media really took notice. Not just of the money, but of the message. People started calling what I'd built a movement. I didn't correct them. I just kept working. One afternoon, my mom came to visit my office for the first time. She walked through the space slowly, touching the walls like she needed proof that it was real. She stopped in front of a framed photo on my desk. It was of my team. Diverse. Smiling. Strong. "You did all this without me," she said quietly. I nodded. She looked at me then, really looked, and said, "You were never useless. I just didn't know how to see you." That sentence landed differently than the first one ever had. It didn't wound. It didn't heal. It simply closed a chapter. Because by then, my story no longer revolved around her words at all. And what happened next, the moment that truly left her speechless, not with guilt, but with awe, is something I need to tell you carefully. The moment that truly left her speechless didn't happen in a dramatic room with cameras flashing or people applauding. It happened quietly, the way the most meaningful moments often do, when no one is performing and nothing needs to be proven. A year after that office visit, I made a decision I hadn't talked about publicly. Not to my team. Not to investors. Not even to my closest friends. I had been circling it in my mind for months, letting it take shape slowly, deliberately. I wanted to go back to where everything began. Not to confront the past, but to transform it. I bought the old factory on the edge of my hometown. If you're listening and you've lived in one place long enough, you know exactly the kind of building I mean. Abandoned. Rusted sign barely hanging on. Windows clouded with dust and time. It had been shut down years ago, taking hundreds of jobs with it. Including, at one point, my mother's. That factory's closure had hardened her in ways I didn't understand until much later. I didn't buy it as an investment flip. I bought it. With a plan. We renovated it completely. Not cheaply. Not quickly. We turned it into a training and operations center tied directly to my company. Real jobs. Real benefits. No empty promises. We partnered with local colleges, trade schools, and community programs. I insisted on one thing above all else. Anyone who had ever been told they were not enough would get a fair shot. The town didn't know what to make of it at first. Rumors spread. People speculated. When the announcement finally came, it felt like a ripple moving through the community. Jobs coming back. Opportunity coming back. Hope, cautiously peeking its head out. I invited my mom to the opening. She didn't understand why at first. She thought it was just another ribbon cutting, another business obligation. When she arrived and recognized the building, she froze. Just stood there, staring at it like she was seeing a ghost. "You bought this?" she asked. I nodded. We walked inside together. The place looked nothing like it used to. Light. Space. People moving with purpose. Young and old working side by side. The air didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt alive. I didn't say much. I let the building speak for itself. Eventually, we reached a quiet corner overlooking the floor. She leaned on the railing, gripping it tightly. I could see her chest rise and fall, fast and shallow. Then she started crying. Not from sadness. From understanding. "This place broke me," she said softly. "And you turned it into something that heals people." That's when she went completely quiet. No commentary. No opinions. No defenses. Just silence. That was the moment. Not because she was impressed. But because she finally saw the full picture. The empire wasn't just money. It wasn't just success. It was impact. It was intention. It was choosing to build instead of burn. A few weeks later, she did something I never expected. She asked if she could volunteer. Not because she needed to. Not because she wanted credit. Because she wanted to give something back. I agreed, with one condition. She wouldn't tell anyone who she was to me. Watching her help people who reminded me of myself, that was something I didn't know I needed to see. As the years passed, the story spread. People asked me in interviews what motivated me. I stopped talking about proving anyone wrong. I talked about responsibility. About what happens when you survive something hard and choose to make it mean something. And then life slowed down, just enough for reflection. One evening, my mom and I sat on my back porch watching the sun go down. She was quieter than usual. Finally, she said, "I used to think strength was making people tough. Now I know it's making them feel safe." I didn't respond right away. I just let that truth settle between us. That night, after she left, I realized something important. The greatest revenge wasn't success. It wasn't recognition. It wasn't even her apology. It was peace. But there's one final piece to this story. One last moment that ties everything together. And it's the reason I'm telling you this now. If you're ready for the final part, part 5, tell me to continue. The last piece of this story didn't come with a big announcement or a headline. It came wrapped in an ordinary envelope, the kind you almost throw away with the junk mail. No return address. Just my name, handwritten, a little shaky. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Inside was a letter from my mother. Not a long one. Not dramatic. Just honest. She wrote about growing up afraid. About learning early that love was conditional and survival came before softness. About how she thought preparing a child for the world meant breaking them before the world could. She wrote about that morning in the kitchen, the clock, the pamphlets on the table. She said she remembered my face. She said she remembered thinking she was being realistic, not cruel. And she said that realization was the heaviest thing she now carried. Then she wrote something that stopped me cold. "You built everything I was too afraid to even imagine. And you did it without becoming what hurt you." I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. I didn't cry. I just sat there, breathing, feeling something settle deep in my chest. Not pride. Not relief. Completion. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a small high school. No cameras. No press. Just a gym full of teenagers pretending not to listen. The organizer asked me if I wanted to focus on success, money, or entrepreneurship. I told them no. I wanted to talk about being underestimated. As I stood there, looking at those young faces, I realized something. Every single one of them was carrying a sentence someone had given them. Some of them already believed it. Some were fighting it. Some hadn't heard it yet, but they would. I told them my story. Not the polished version. The kitchen. The word. The doubt. I told them that sometimes the people who hurt you are operating from their own fear, not your truth. And that their words only become permanent if you let them move in and unpack. After the talk, a girl waited until everyone else had left. She stood there twisting her hands, staring at the floor. Then she said, "My dad says I'll never be anything. What if he's right?" I looked at her and saw myself, 17 again, standing at that table. I said, "What if he's wrong, and you spend your whole life proving it to yourself instead of to him?" She smiled. Just a little. But it was enough. That night, driving home, I thought about all of you listening right now. Especially those of you over 60. Those of you who grew up in a time when feelings weren't discussed and toughness was mistaken for love. Some of you were told you were useless. Some of you said it to someone else without meaning to. And some of you have carried both roles in one lifetime. Here's what I've learned. Revenge doesn't heal you. Success doesn't heal you. Even apologies don't fully heal you. What heals you is choosing to stop the echo. I didn't build an empire to silence my mother. I built it because a 17-year-old girl needed proof that her life could be bigger than one sentence. Everything after that was a byproduct. My mom and I have a relationship now. Not perfect. Not storybook. But real. We talk. We laugh sometimes. We leave space when we need to. And neither of us pretends the past didn't happen. We just don't let it drive anymore. Every once in a while, she'll look around at what I've built, at the people whose lives have changed because of it, and she'll shake her head softly. Still a little amazed. Still a little quiet. And that silence doesn't feel heavy anymore. It feels respectful. If you're listening to this and you've ever been called useless, let me say this clearly. That word says nothing about your capacity and everything about someone else's fear. You are not too late. You are not invisible. And you are not done. And if you're listening and realizing you might have said something that stayed with someone longer than you intended, it's not too late for honesty either. Acknowledgement can be a bridge, if you're brave enough to step onto it. Thank you for sitting with this story. If you felt something while listening, if it reminded you of your own life or someone you love, then subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And I'd truly love to know, from where are you listening today?